G'day. Welcome to another episode of the Future of Reason podcast. We are here today as something of a follow up to the other podcast that Jonathan and I did called How Wrong is Jordan Peterson? We were quite happy to receive some of the criticisms that we did of that podcast, and we've taken them on board and thought about it, and we felt like we didn't address a couple of points, and we felt like a couple of points were addressed inadequately. And I don't think that some of the more subtle, important points of the case were made as well as they could have been. So we're recording this to try to cap off the topic. So what's been your reaction to the criticism?
Well, it's something we anticipated. We anticipated a lot of pushback from Peterson followers because naturally, he's achieved quite a lot of notoriety and success recently, and for good reason. And but I guess I was surprised at the sheer volume of criticism, and I was surprised at the volume of views in general. So, it was sort of bittersweet, It was a pleasant surprise because I absolutely didn't expect so many views at all. But it was also bitter because it's unfortunate that there was so much misunderstanding. And that's something I'd like to rectify.
Yeah, that seems to just completely taint this entire topic when you're talking about Peterson, whether it's Sam Harris feeling like he's misunderstood by Peterson, Peterson feeling like he's misunderstood by Harris, Peterson fans feeling like Peterson's misunderstood. Everyone's misunderstood. Let's just say nobody understands anything,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought that we would start by going into trying to show that Peterson actually does believe the things that we say he believes, or at least that the way we claim he views the world is the way he actually does view the world. And so we've got a couple of quotes here. This quote is from, where's this quote from? It's from an article, right, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think the article is actually called Maps of Meaning. And so I think it's a companion piece for his book. And in it, he addresses the nature of truth, our inability to access objective reality, etc. But it seems relevant.
Right, and so that quote is, "We think we live in the objective world, but we do not. The objective world is something that has been conjured for us recently, absurdly recently from the perspective of biology, by the processes of science operating over a span of 5 centuries. So what does this quote sound like to you?
Well, it sounds to me like he's straightforwardly rejecting our ability to interact with objective reality. There was a lot of confusion around the claims I made in the last podcast. A lot of people seemed to believe that I was claiming that Peterson's asserting that there is no such thing as objective reality and only our subjective inner experience. When I said no such thing, I said that Peterson believes that objective reality does indeed exist, but he doubts our ability to interact with it at any level or at any reliable level. And so truth, as conceived by Jordan Peterson, is defined by our ability to attain certain goals. And so, of course, according to him, truth is adjudicated to the extent that it promotes survival. So truth can only be adjudicated to the extent that it's successful in achieving a certain goal. And the goal, his epistemological gold standard is survival. So insofar as a truth serves a certain Darwinian end, then it's true or true enough. And surprisingly, a lot of people reject even that. It seems to me that that's self-evidently what he's claiming. I mean, especially when you look at the quote that you just offered. But nevertheless, they reject that interpretation of what he's saying, and it's strange, especially when you consider the fact that, I mean, if you're to read the literature advanced by the progenitors of early pragmatism, they make the same claims. They're not so eager to use Darwinism to make those claims. They say, well, in the case of C.S. Peirce, he claims that truth is based on interpretation. We never have perfect or omniscient access to objective reality, and so truth is based on the individual's interpretation. And those interpretations which are useful are more true than those which are not. And so these are the basic principles Peterson's building on. And so to deny that Peterson is at some level rejecting our ability to access objective reality seems strange, especially in light of that quote. I mean, he straightforwardly says that objective reality is a convection created by science, 5 generations of science, or 5 decades of science, and that, you know, all we really have is survival. And so it just seems pretty clear to me.
Right, and it's so many of the things he says are just completely consistent with some of the other things he says in a way where I don't understand how you can deny certain things that he's said. I mean, if you listen to his podcast with Sam Harris, the first one, What is True, so many times when he's speaking to Sam and Sam pushes back on Peterson's ideas in one of the strongest ways that you could push back on these ideas, Peterson is left stating exactly what he thinks in increasingly absurd ways because he becomes forced to. He's forced to retreat into that space where his ideas become absurd, which reveals them to be, if not wrong, totally useless. And so some of those quotes that Jonathan went through and found is, and you know, we're going to get some people saying that we're greenwalding him or pulling a Reza Aslan, but seriously, we're really not. So he says, the truth of a statement can only be adjudicated in terms of how successful it is in attaining its aim. Is that not just clear cut as it can possibly be, like a katana slicing through a watermelon, you know?
Yeah.
He says,
Absolutely.
He says, our world conceptions are actually nested inside of the Darwinian system. There is no truth that can surpass Darwinism. We just can't get beyond it. The Newtonian worldview is nested inside of the Darwinian worldview. And then he goes on to say that pragmatic truth is deeper than scientific truth. And I think that we'll get there, but look at those quotes that he's saying. These are not taken out of context. You can listen to this podcast. This is the worldview that he's pushing forward. And he does so with, I don't want to say confidence, because he does seem to have some humbleness in his own ideas, but he's pushing them forward with a lot of strength. behind his... He's doing it forcefully. He's not doing it in a, hey guys, what do you think about this idea? This idea, what do you think? No, he's going out of his way to state these things. And like I said, we're not taking this out of context. If you want to try to show how we are, then go ahead. Find something else that he says that contradicts this. Show us what was said before these things that is somehow relevant. I don't think you'll be able to. So, I'm not entirely sure what else we could do to try to demonstrate this point, that this is what Peterson actually says, but that's been one of the most frequently leveled criticisms, is that we don't understand Peterson. And I don't want to just go, well, you too, but if you think that Peterson doesn't push forward the idea that the Newtonian worldview is nested inside the Darwinian worldview, the truth of a statement can only be adjudicated in terms of how successful it is in attaining its aim. These are direct quotes, and they're not taken out of context. And even if how could they be taken out of context? Show us how. Another response that we got was somebody linking to Jordan Peterson's podcast with Brett Weinstein on the Joe Rogan Experience, where Jordan Peterson made the case that Sam Harris is wrong about Jordan Peterson gerrymandering the truth. He might not have used that word, but oddly enough, Jordan Peterson actually admitted in the What is True podcast that he was gerrymandering the meaning of the word truth. But in that podcast with Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson basically makes the case that truth used to mean, or the word true, it's better to frame it in true, used to mean reliably, it was something like reliably, takes you reliably to where your aim is. Am I correct?
Yeah, no, I think that's an accurate description of his definition of truth.
Yeah, I might not have the words quite right. I should have written them down, but I'm pretty sure I'm right.
Yeah, no, that's how he defines the nature of truth. His criteria for truth is something else entirely, but he does seem to believe that truth, rather than being something that corresponds with objective reality, is something that is revealed to us. And so that he seems to like that definition of truth because it corresponds with his version of epistemology. And so yeah, I just I wanted to touch on what you said earlier. I wanted to reiterate that if there's someone out there who can demonstrate that Kyle and I are getting this totally wrong, we'd love to hear it. We'd love to hear what you have to say. But he and I have gone through these podcasts. We've gone through his work. We've read and listened to hours of Jordan Peterson's work. And we've read and listened to the work of other highly influential pragmatists, and the same theme is reiterated over and over again. The idea is that we don't have access to objective reality, and so truth must be adjudicated according to a certain conception of utility. And this is consistent. There's there's over 13 different versions of pragmatism, but this is the consistent principle in all of them. And there's no reason to think that Jordan Peterson is all of a sudden abandoned this core principle. And his work attests to the fact that he hasn't. I mean, he repeats this principle ad nauseum. And so we've had a lot of criticisms of our description of Peterson's argument, and that's fine, but we'd like someone to attempt to present an alternative description of his argument, one that demonstrates that we have no idea what we're talking about.
Yes, we would love to be shown that we have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because, like, dealing with his comments on Brett Weinstein, where he basically says, well, this is what true used to mean. And I noticed that too. So even today, there's a lot of love songs or something that say, you know, I think there's a Foreigner song, one of Foreigner's songs, it feels so right, so warm and true.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not saying it feels so right, so warm and scientifically accurate. It's obvious that's not what he's saying, right? He does mean true in a way of, like Jordan Peterson is talking about in the Brett Weinstein podcast. I would describe it in that song, so warm and true. It's kind of like, it feels so right, so warm and true. I need to know that you feel it too. So he's talking about his feelings. So he's talking about his feelings guiding him to something that's actually there. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, but that kind of sounds like that fits within what Jordan Peterson's trying to say, where he says that an idea, if it's true, will lead you where you're trying to go. I think that these sound the same to me.
I'm actually hearing something different. When he says true, I'm getting the sense that he means real. You know, that whatever exists between them is real. And obviously it's a more metaphoric take on, you know, the standard definition of truth, but I get the sense that he's saying that there's something palpable between us, and it's concrete, it's real, it's something that actually exists. And I mean, obviously, as I said, it's more poetic, it's more metaphoric, but it just seems like an alternate definition of true, which is derived from the standard definition of true.
Okay, so you think I'm a little bit off there.
Well, I know what you mean. I do think that truth is used in that way, and it has been. I just in that case, I'm hearing something different, and I didn't want to, I wouldn't want to lie to you.
Okay, no worries. So, but it's definitely true of old texts where they would use the word true, like the arrow is straight and true. I mean, Jordan Peterson's right that's what it used to mean. But, I mean, two things. I don't want to get into the issue of translations, but there's a translation issue where these old texts didn't use the same English we did. Even 100 years ago, the English that we used then is not the same as the English used today, which is not the same as the English, well, the Bible was written in English, but it's not directly translatable. And I mean, I don't want to get into that issue, but it is an issue that you're going to need to confront if you want to say, well, this is what the semantics of this word was 2000 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's the issue of meanings changing over time. I mean, that happens with just about everything. The meaning of life. I don't mean the meaning of life as in why we're here. I mean biological life. That's changed. I mean, we're on the cusp of creating completely artificial life, which is going to have to rewrite the definition of what we mean by life.
Yeah.
And even the word science comes from Latin word, which was just the word no.
Yeah.
And then it's come to mean a structured, formal, very specific definition in use today. And you can't just call anything science. You can't just say, well, I'm a stock trader and I just know that IBM stocks are going to tank tomorrow. That's science, because science used to mean no.
Yeah.
It's like, no. It's like, no. You can't do that. That's not how language works.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to say that there's only one definition of truth that's valid. I mean, I'm sure you are going to try to get into that. But you can't just fall back on old definitions and say, well, this is how this old definition used to describe a word used today. So therefore, I can do what I want with it. I can use this old definition to justify using obfuscating language that convinces people that silly ideas are real.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's
yeah.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
I
I had very little to say. Go ahead.
No. Well, I was just going to say that it's odd that Peterson places so much weight on this particular definition of truth. I mean, as though it takes primacy over all other conceptions of truth because it was the original conception of truth. But there's no reason to be confident that that's even the concept they had in mind in the first place when you consider the polysemous nature of archaic texts. You know, I mean, these ancient words meant so many different things, and you know, we can only interpret them through linguistic constructs we have now. So there's no guarantee that this meant to the people who employed this language at the time what it seems to mean to us. And also, it's just, language was so unrefined and it was so clumsy at the time. These were doing their best to describe the world around them, to understand their environment, and they used the conceptual resources they had at the time to cobble together this vocabulary and this alphabet and this language. And we've refined these definitions and these concepts because our language is built on the back of centuries of linguistic advancements and, you know, refinements to certain concepts and our ability to demarcate in ways that they never could. There's no reason to say that that conception of truth takes primacy over all others because it was the original. We understand truth better now than anyone before us ever did. And I'm sure that's something that Peterson's followers will take issue with, but we've just had so much more time to refine these ideas. And so I think it's self-evident that the reason we privilege the definition of truth we have now is because it's just the more accurate version of truth, to use a tautology, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, as you mentioned, that they used the conceptual tools that they had available at the time, and I mean, does anyone who's not religious, and I don't mean, I'm not trying to cherry pick just people who aren't religious, but I am trying to distinguish between somebody who was brought up and indoctrinated into an idea and somebody who wasn't.
Yeah.
But how many people out there who weren't indoctrinated into a religion actually believe that there are significant amounts of knowledge and truth contained in old religious texts that we either have forgotten about, have abandoned, lost, or don't know for some other reason? Almost every single claim, whether it's moral, ethical, science-based, epistemological, logic-based, mathematical, sociological, political, historical, almost everything that we can say in any of these fields, we can put together claims more accurate than the claims that these old people made in their respective texts. The idea that there is significant amounts of deeply important ideas contained there, I don't see any good evidence of that. And whether it's Peterson or even more explicitly Peterson's fans keeps making claims about like postmodernism and Marxism, about how atheism and something that they would call scientism, like the fallacious expansion of science into other worldviews, that's for a whole other topic. But these people say that these atheistic ideas are what's leading to the destruction of the world, and that's the evidence.
Yeah.
But we can debate that, because the evidence shows that that's probably not the case. And even if it is true that there could be some setbacks along the way, that doesn't mean that the older knowledge is somehow better. And it doesn't mean that you get a straightforward reading from the older knowledge into Peterson's ideas. When you see Peterson talking on a stage about, well, this is the interpretation of Cain and Abel, this is what it means, if you look at, I don't know, Pinocchio or The Lion King, this is a recurring theme between the two, and this is evidence that this deep psychological idea is timeless and we've forgotten about it and we need to resurrect it. We need to resurrect our father. I mean, this is like... The standard of evidence here makes the standard of evidence in feminist theory look like physics.
Yeah.
I mean, at least they refer to numbers sometimes. And we could do an entire one of these talks on the issue of Islam and Christianity and why you're viewing this historical pragmatism or historical Darwinianism through the perspective of Christianity. Like, why are you privileging Christianity? I mean, if it turns out that science is bad for the survival of humans, well, Islam's doing a pretty good job of holding that back. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no postmodernist feminists in Afghanistan, and if they are, they're sure keeping their mouth shut.
Yeah.
And like I said, we could do an entire talk about how the evidence that's usually cited is just completely bullshit, frankly. I mean, you're using historical evidence to justify a religion. And like I said earlier, if I'm wrong about this, show me how I'm wrong. But this really looks like what you're doing right here when you try to say, well, history is evidence that we should go to Christianity. And
Yeah.
outside of that, there doesn't seem to be any justification for what you could call vanilla pragmatism. At least, there doesn't seem to be for me, because all of Peterson and Peterson's followers' claims about pragmatism seem nested in his ideas about history and religion, which seem to presuppose certain things that they then later reject.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So, can you go into pragmatism, the vanilla pragmatism? Just because one thing that is a little bit daunting for me is the vocabulary of these topics. These ideas are not that unintuitive, but sometimes the vocabulary is a bit much. Can you try to outline what vanilla pragmatism is first, and then I'll ask you a question or two about what's your argument against it.
Well, yeah. Well, as I said at the beginning, I did my best to look into the arguments advanced by, the founders of this philosophy, and actually, I did quite a bit of reading on the subject, and they all seem to share the same principles. I mean, there are three men credited with the founding of this philosophy, typically, but C.S. Peirce is the one, I think, who articulates these ideas the most effectively or articulately, and so I'll defer to him. And again, he argues that human beings don't ever have privileged access to naked truth. All we ever have are interpretations, and the interpretations which are most useful are true, and obviously those that aren't useful aren't true. And he justifies this premise, and all pragmatists justify this premise by claiming that reality is an ever-changing, hyper-complex system that is perturbed as we interact with it. And so we're helpless to ever accurately describe the contents or character of reality. I mean, we just don't have that capacity. So pragmatists postulate that because all beliefs are goal-oriented, truth claims can only be adjudicated in accord with how successful they are in attaining their goals. And so the idea is that there's an ethic embedded in every action and in every belief, and that ethic is that if it works, then it's true. And so, I mean, it's just, pragmatism seems to insist upon itself as the most eminently reasonable theory of truth, because it has criteria that seem intuitively reasonable. And according to most pragmatists, it's the deepest form of truth. But I mean, as I'm sure we'll get into,
I'm just letting you know.
pragmatism suffers from nesting problems of its own. It always says that realism is nested inside of pragmatism. I'll argue that that's not true, first of all. But if pragmatism is the deepest form of truth, then it can't appeal to any conceptions of truth outside of its own paradigm, and yet it does that routinely in order to justify its fundamental claims. And so, I mean, yeah, I guess we'll get into this. So I'll just, I'll open up the floor for any questions you might have.
Thank you. Very generous.
You're welcome.
So it sounds to me like pragmatism presupposes values within its epistemology. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And values, I mean, however you look at them, they do depend on epistemology. You know, I mean, we have to know something, or we have to at least have a good reason for affirming something as true. We can't just presuppose it without a reason. Anyway, what was that leading to?
So what values is pragmatism presupposing? Like, it's obvious that it does. So what is it presupposing in terms of values?
Well, it's presupposing the a priori primacy of survival as a value. And there doesn't seem to be any epistemological reason for that. And if there is, I haven't heard one. It just seems to be the case that well, actually, let me clarify. Darwinian pragmatists assert that survival is the deepest value. Pragmatists in general assert that utility is the deepest value. And again, there's no reason for asserting that. It's not grounded in anything concrete. It just seems to be an assertion.
So this is in contrast to the realist epistemology, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So how do you get to the realist epistemology without pragmatism?
Well, realism follows quite straightforwardly from what we call properly basic beliefs or axiomatic truths. You know, they're the most fundamental kind of truth. They're non-doxastic, which is to say that they don't depend on the verification of other truths because they are the deepest form of truth, and all other truths depend on them. And they're axiomatic, as I just said, so they're self-evident and self-defining. So these are just the most basic kind of truths, fundamental axioms. And realism follows naturally from these because realism is intuitive. I mean, there's a specific number of properly basic beliefs, and of course these beliefs are necessary to grant in order to affirm the truth of anything, even our ability to affirm the truth of anything. You have to grant these properly basic beliefs if you want to make judgments about the nature of truth. And so induction, for instance, is a properly basic belief. Deduction, cause and effect, is a properly basic belief. Truth, the notion of truth, is a properly basic belief, the fundamental notion of truth. And so you have to presuppose or grant the notion of truth before you can ever talk about truth. And so this leads me to the one argument that is most devastating to pragmatism, traditional pragmatism, and, of course, as a result, all versions of pragmatism. And so what does it mean to say that pragmatism is true? I mean, true according to what? It's obviously true according to pragmatism, but of course it would be if pragmatism is defining itself as true, but that's a tautology. To justify a theory of truth by appealing to the truths generated by that theory of truth is to beg the question. And if your theory of truth is based on circular reasoning, then what reason do you have to grant primacy to this theory of truth over any other? If pragmatism presupposes its own validity, it's hard to see why anyone would find it any more compelling than realism. But like I said, pragmatists assert that pragmatic truths are the deepest kinds of truths. But how does it ground the truth it uses to justify its standard of truth? When pragmatists claim that reality is hyper-complex and that all beliefs are guided by an ethic, how do they ground those truths? They can't be grounded in pragmatism because they're the truths upon which pragmatism is based. The pragmatic standard of truth presumes necessarily a deeper notion of truth. And it's a notion of truth which is not arbitrated by pragmatic criteria. When the pragmatist argues that the pragmatic standard of truth is the deepest form of truth because reality is hyper-complex and we only ever have interpretations, he's grounding those claims in an even deeper conception of truth than pragmatism. And I would argue that it's actually quite obvious when you think about it. Take the pragmatic standard of utility. So if the criterion by which truth is dictated is how useful any given belief or action is, on what basis does a pragmatist establish the conception of utility? Whether or not it's useful is the criterion by which they adjudicate whether or not it's true. So the definition of success here cannot be grounded in pragmatism. There's no getting around this. Unless one is already presupposing the validity of logic, there's no basis for asserting that belief A was successful because of outcome A. And since the pragmatic standard of truth depends on the validity of this proposition, it doesn't make sense to say that logic is grounded in pragmatism. So it doesn't even make sense to say that this thing is useful because of this thing. I mean, it's just, these truths cannot be grounded in pragmatism. And you obviously can't say that any given definition of utility is true unless you have established its utility, but you can't establish its utility without already having a definition of truth. Of necessity, the pragmatic conception of utility must appeal to an outside notion of truth. And so that's it. I mean, pragmatists, in order to ground the claims they're using to argue for the primacy of pragmatic truth, since they do claim that pragmatic truth is the deepest kind of truth, they have to appeal to a transcendent notion of truth which is not constrained by pragmatic criteria. I mean, this is devastating for pragmatism because obviously that means it appeals to another notion of truth, a deeper one based on properly basic beliefs. But it's also the notion of truth, these properly basic beliefs, that realism is grounded in. But the difference is that realism straightforwardly follows from those intuitive, non-dosastic beliefs. Realism doesn't attempt to cherry pick those properly basic beliefs, whereas pragmatism obviously does. It will draw its premises from those properly basic beliefs, but then reject everything else But realism follows straightforwardly from those properly basic beliefs, which honestly seems like a more intellectually honest theory of truth. If these are intuitive, properly basic, foundational concepts, then the theory of truth which follows from them straightforwardly rather than cherry picking from them seems like the one most reliable. Pragmatism is positing arbitrary distinctions between some properly basic beliefs and others. And so if nothing else, there's no reason to suggest that pragmatism is any more reliable as a theory of truth than any other. So that's the point I wanted to get across.
Well, I mean, that makes...
You still there?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Well, thank you.
So, I am slightly stuck as to what you mean by properly basic beliefs. I know that that's a term and a concept used widely, but is it possible to define that for me quickly, or give me give me like a rock solid example of a properly basic belief and why that's a properly basic belief?
Well, I'll try to both define it and give an example of a properly basic belief. So an example would be, like I said, the very notion of truth itself. And so we have to grant the notion of truth in the very beginning before we can even talk about the nature of truth. Before we can ever so there's just a certain point where if you drill down to the core of knowledge far enough, you realize that there is bedrock and there's no going below that or beyond it. And the questions can no longer be answered. And so you can ask a series of questions about the nature of reality, and eventually you get to a point where you ask someone, well, how do you know that logic is valid, or that induction or deduction is valid? And that's not something that you can answer without, appealing to induction or deduction. It's just a properly basic belief which insists upon its own justification. It's self-evident. Otherwise, you'd be unable to access truth. Now, I mean, on a superficial level, some people will say, well, this seems to lend itself to Peterson's conception of pragmatism.
Yeah, I was just thinking that would be an argument they could make.
But you'd have to presuppose those ideas in the first place before you can ever make the assertions they make. So pragmatists are tacitly granting these presuppositions in order to make the assessments and the appraisals about truth they do. And so the pragmatist says, of course, that reality is a hyper-complex system. But I mean, you have to grant logic to come to that conclusion in the first place. Without logic, it's impossible to make assessments about the nature of truth at all. It's impossible to even make that judgment. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, you have to first affirm that it's true for you to even make judgments like that. And the pragmatist does that when they presuppose their ability to affirm the truth of reality, and that it's hyper complex, and that we can't access it unless it's useful. So you see, those are themselves truths, assertions that need to be qualified, and they can only be qualified if you grant certain properly basic beliefs. Without properly basic beliefs, you can do nothing. Epistemology, knowledge, it's all hopeless. You're just like a ball of sensation floating around a totally unintelligible universe, you know? So again, I reiterate, in order for pragmatists to make the judgments that they do, they have to already grant some of these properly basic beliefs. But of course, they're using some of those properly basic beliefs to reject all of the others. But there's no reason for granting the ones that they have granted if their whole point is that there's no reason for us to trust knowledge at all. In that case, why grant the ones that they've granted? Does that...
Yeah, so you're saying that it kind of sounds to me like a properly basic belief is like when you have a child, and the child is asking questions that are usually just why. Well,
Yes.
why does the sun rise? Because the earth is round and the earth is spinning. Well, why? Well, because of gravity. Well, why? Well, because of the space-time continuum. Why? Blah, 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 blah. And it sounds like a properly
Yeah.
basic belief is kind of like the foundational answers to those questions that you get stopped by.
Yeah, you can't go any further than that. That's
Right,
it. I mean, that's
right,
epistemological bedrock.
right. And so the argument against pragmatism becomes that a pragmatist never winds up hitting that bedrock because they presuppose certain things that circularly rely on the bedrock without admitting that that's the bedrock.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's a much simpler way of putting it. I mean, they
Well,
do. They task. Yeah.
I'm relying on you to go the extensive route here. So
Yeah. It's Yeah, that's exactly what they do. They just, either way you cut it, epistemology, knowledge, truth, our conception of truth, it relies on these properly basic beliefs. It relies on this bedrock. You cannot make judgments about truth without it. Yet pragmatists rely on this bedrock without admitting that they do. Because, I mean, think of it this way. The pragmatist asserts that reality is hypercomplex and that, the only way to adjudicate truth is with reference to how useful it is. I mean, that's always subject to the why. Why is that true? How do you know that? Eventually, they will have to appeal to those same properly basic beliefs in order to justify those claims. And once they do, then it's subject to, well, why are you granting these properly basic beliefs and not these? Why are you granting these and rejecting all of these others? And realism avoids that by straightforwardly granting all of properly basic beliefs, which are intuitive, they're natural. None of us ever just sign a checklist of properly basic beliefs and say, yes, I agree to believe all of these things. They're natural, they're intuitive, they're properly basic. Without them, we could not function. And that's as good of a basis for epistemology as you're ever going to have. It's the most instinctive thing that we have. And everything that we know, everything we do is predicated on it. And it's also true of pragmatists, but they don't acknowledge it and they cherry pick from it.
yeah, because if you're going to, it everything that you're saying is like the pragmatist. The pragmatist is making this issue more complex than
Yeah.
the realist perspective.
Yes, and unnecessarily so, and they don't have a good reason for doing it.
Yeah, which leads me to the way it always sounds to me, where it always seems like motivated reasoning to get to some place that they want to be.
Yes.
Like there's no reason to go this route, but you go this route because it allows you to smuggle in the things you want to smuggle in along the way without properly justifying why you're smuggling those things in.
Yeah.
And they can't
Yeah.
stand realism because it doesn't let them do that because it's properly basic.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that we've, especially you, man, I think that this is about, I think we've really destroyed this topic, and
Yeah.
I leave it to anybody listening, whether you listen to the first one or not. I'm assuming everybody listening to this has heard the first one we've done. If you can show us something that we're missing, if you can show
Yeah.
us a Jordan Peterson quote linked to a video where he says something that is completely contrary to the things that we've claimed, even though we've presented quotes and sources for certain claims he's made, we'd love to be proven wrong, but I don't see it. Everything that has been said here is not in any way a straw man of, or a misrepresentation of what Jordan Peterson has said, and it doesn't seem to have a leg to stand on.
Yeah. And if you want to assert that it is a straw man, then I mean, show us how it is. At least
Yeah, I've seen a lot of
present to us an alternative.
yeah, I've
Yeah.
seen a lot of assertions and very little in the way of demonstrating how.
Yeah. I want to point out that the responses to this video are going to be in the vein of, well, I mean, you guys are just, you're being pedantic, you're grappling with semantics, but I mean, this is the sort of argument where
You have to.
he's yeah, I mean, he's actually,
That's his argument, is being pedantic and being
yeah,
semantic.
exactly. Yeah, it is a semantic argument at its core, and it's extraordinarily pedantic. It's you have to have that battle eventually if you want to get at bedrock. If you want to talk about first principles, then that's what this argument is about. So, I mean, I've seen that argument way too many times, and it's just, I'm tired of having to deal with it.
You know, this is all really interesting and I'm learning a lot, but I am slightly feeling tired of it too, man. So,
Yeah.
unless you have anything else to add, I think we should uh, pull the curtain down.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's good.
All right, cool. So, thanks a lot. You were very helpful and you were very coherent, and I hope that anybody listening to this has also learned what I've learned. This has been a learning experience for me. So thanks for doing what you do.
Thank you. And I've enjoyed it.
Cool. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.